Welcome to Lesson 3 in our series, The Leadership Style of Nehemiah, and today's my birthday. Woo-hoo! I'm your Adventure Bible Studies guide, Jimmy Seitz. Thanks for joining me for this fascinating study. Now, let me give you a flyover review and context of where we are for just a moment. What we have going on in Israel is them disobeying the Sabbath laws that God had put into play all the way from the beginning of creation, all the way up to the Mount Sinai experience of the giving of the law, and then all the way to the point in 721 BC. That's when the Assyrians came in and invaded Jerusalem, and they began to break it down and take away some of the people. Then Sennacherib, the king, came in and he besieged Jerusalem for 2 years. That's when the amazing miracle happened where God's army, not man's army, killed Sennacherib's army, and he made Sennacherib have to fall back and leave. So it's very interesting because in archaeological digs, they have found Sennacherib's trophy room, and he had all these depictions of the wars that he had won. And then he had this one thing in there, just one little statement about this. I shut up Israel like a bird in a cage. That's all it said. Yeah, he didn't want to write that negative part, did he? Oh, yeah. I lost over 100,000 guys. You know, God killed them all. I never did take Jerusalem. That's not on his plaque. So he just left that off. But that was Sennacherib, and that was the Syrians, and that was the first invasion that took away the 10 northern tribes of Israel. But they didn't get Jerusalem. They didn't get Judah, the 2 southern tribes. So the 2 southern tribes of Judah remaining they had a period of time where they were fine and prosperous, while their 10 northern buddies up there, they were in captivity. Around 606 BC, that all changed because then Nebuchadnezzar came along with his son Nebuchadrezzar, and that was in 606 and 597 and 586 BC, and they sacked Jerusalem. It took them, these 3-decade tours where they would come in, decades apart. And they took away 90% of all the citizens of Judah and Jerusalem and took them into Babylonian captivity. Now, later on, the king of Syria, Xerxes, and then his son Artaxerxes, maybe he liked taxing people, bad joke. Anyway, they had taken over. So now they have the exiles, and the exile of Israel lasted 70 years from that point. Do you remember why? In the previous lessons, we talked about it. It's because the Israelites had not kept that Sabbath year that they were supposed to keep for over a 490-year period. So they missed 70 collective Sabbath years to let their land rest every 7th year. Therefore, the Babylonian captivity lasted 70 years. Wow. At the end of that time, it was time for God to move his people back because, after all, it is their land. And so he raised up what we'd call the shortest man in the Bible, Nehemiah. He also had a guy named Ezra. And if you want to read those 2 books, read them together. Read Ezra first and then Nehemiah. That's what tells the story that we are studying. But we're intentionally looking at just one of those 2 men, Nehemiah. Specifically, we're trying to find out what his leadership style is because it's very applicable to us today. And we want to learn his traits. We want to learn his actions when it comes to leadership. Now, Nehemiah is the cupbearer of King Artaxerxes, and he gets a depressing report from his visiting brother about Jerusalem and the region. And that sets the context for what we're doing, and today we're going to pick up in chapter 2. So let's go to chapter 2. If you have a Bible, you can get it out and follow with me, or you can just listen and I'll put the words on the screen, all right? But we're just going to read chapter 2. Here we go. During the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why do you look so sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." I was overwhelmed with fear and replied to the king, "Oh, may the king live forever. Why should I not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king asked me, "What's your request?" So I prayed to the God of the heavens, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I might rebuild it." The king, with the queen seated beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you return?" So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me. I also said to the king, If it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates River, so that they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress, the city wall, and the home where I will live. The king granted my request, for the gracious hand of my God was on me. I went to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent officers of the infantry and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard that someone had come to pursue the prosperity of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. So, of course, you're going to have antagonists, right? This would make a good Hollywood movie because you have protagonist and antagonist. You set up the good, you set up the bad. It's the old good versus evil plot. It's going on right here. How does he handle it? After I arrived in Jerusalem and had been there 3 days, I got up at night and took a few men with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God had laid on my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the one I was riding. I went out at night through the valley gate toward the Serpent's Well and the Dung Gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. I went on to the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but farther down it became too narrow for my animal to go through. So I went up at night by the way of the valley and inspected the wall. Then heading back, I entered through the valley gate and returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, for I had not told the Jews, priests, nobles, officials, or the rest of those who would be doing the work. So I said to them, "You see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned. Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem's wall so that we will no longer be a disgrace." I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me, and what the king had said to me. They said, "Let's start rebuilding." And their hands were strengthened to do this good work. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about this, they mocked and despised us and said, "What is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" I gave them this reply: "The God of the heavens is the one who will grant us success. We, his servants, will start building, but you have no share, right, or historic claim in Jerusalem." So there you go. You just heard the story. Now let's go back and let's parse this thing out. Let's dig a little deeper into this story and see if we can't find some gold nuggets emerging. You know, I did a cave dig once when my kids were small. There was a family cave. It was in our family for a very long time on my mom's side. It was in Cave City, Arkansas. And we had an opportunity to go in there and just kind of dig around and see what we could find for about 4 hours. And man, did we come up with some stuff. We found a silver spoon from the 1800s, actually. We found a few little bird points, little arrowheads. It was crazy. But it was so fun to dig through there. A lot of the things that you find would not be what we would consider relics, or maybe they're like a broken off arrowhead or a spear point. But we did find 4 or 5 just perfect little points. It was such a fun thing to do. And basically, you do the same thing with Scripture. You go in and you dig and you look and you find things, and maybe there's stuff that's really not all that meaningful. And sometimes you just look in between the lines at stuff that's not in there, and you'll come up with an arrowhead or a gold nugget. Well, it's fun when you start doing that and you start looking at the original languages and you're going deeper and deeper and deeper at the next level, and you find that ancient civilization down in there. That's what we're doing with this Scripture. So let's jump into the cave dig, all right? When Nehemiah is in the king's presence, it's because he had a specific job. He was the cup bearer. He was the one who would taste the wine and taste the food of the king. And, you either really didn't want that job because you could die from it, or you could look at it like, wow, what a great privilege. But just know that as you looked at it like it's a great privilege, you could die any day because your job's to make sure the food's not poisoned. So you taste the food, you taste the wine, make sure it's good before it's ever allowed to be served to the king. And you made sure it was not only not poisoned, but you watched it prepared. You were in charge of making sure it didn't come into the castle poisonous or have something happen to it while it's in the kitchen by some perpetrator. So you actually kept the food and the wine in your presence. So it was a very dangerous job, and many people that were cupbearers did die over the centuries because of that particular job. Now, if you're the king, are you going to give that job to one of your countrymen, or are you going to give it to one of the slaves, one of the exiles? I mean, it's a job for a slave. It's a job for an exile. So with that context in mind, he's in the presence of the king as a exile, a slave, a servant. It's not like they're buddies. It's not like me and my buddy Phil, one of my best friends. When we get together, me and Phil, it's like we're glad to see each other and we're hugging and we're on equal terms and we're hanging out on the back porch or we're hunting or fishing. We're talking about this and that and going to church, all this kind of stuff. We just share life. Hey, the king didn't do that with his servants. So when he is in the presence and the king actually speaks to him, wow, that he would speak to this exile, this slave, this servant, that in and of itself is a huge thing. Understand that. Now here's the next piece we're going to dig out. So King Artaxerxes notices that Nehemiah looks sad. And he says to him, why are you sad? When you're not sick. This is nothing but sadness of his heart. I guarantee you he's not sick, because if he's sick, he can't be taking care of the king's food, right? So we know that. Now at this point, you got to look at Nehemiah's response. And it's a very interesting one. It says this, I was overwhelmed with fear, or by fear in the Hebrew. Overwhelmed by fear. Have you ever been overwhelmed by fear? Let me tell you a story. I was in the Amazon jungle and had been asked to go down and film a documentary to go along with a movie called End of the Spear. It's a movie based on a book that Steve Saint had written about his father, Nate Saint, the missionary pilot. Nate and 4 other young missionaries had given their lives to take the gospel to the Aucas, the fiercest tribe in the history of the world, according to sociologists. In 1956, they died trying to take the gospel to them. Well, Steve was 5 years old at the time, and then later on, at the age of 9, he goes back into the tribe and lives with them, and his aunt, also Aunt Rachel, who had gone back in, also the wife of Jim Elliot, one of the other missionaries. Her name was Elizabeth Elliot, and she wrote the famous book, Through the Gates of Splendor. All of it is just this amazing story, one of the most fascinating stories of the last 2,000 years since Christ died. And to be able to be a part of that, just in a small way, was really a wonderful blessing in my life, and also in the lives of my family, because I took them with me despite the risk. My kids were teenagers at the time, and I had 2 cameramen with me as well, and my wife Amanda. And we all went down and spent several days with Steve and Jenny Saint and the 200 tribesmen that had become believers, God followers, including Minkai, Dabo, Kimo, and Dewey. That's 3 of the 5 killers, plus Dabo, that were right there with us. They were 79, 80, and 81, still very active, and they were the first generation ever to reach that age, because the average Auca died at 30 because they killed each other off with spears. Fierce, fierce people. But this particular group of them had made friendly contact and heard about Wagangi, God, and Itoto, the Son, and how to walk the trail and obey the carvings of the Father on the tree that will lead you to the great longhouse, so that when you die, you can jump the great boa of death and not end up as a termite in a termite mound, but rather end up in the longhouse with God. I mean, that's their way. That's how they see the gospel, and they believe it, and it's amazing. And they're the most peaceful, loving, beautiful people that I have ever been around. They're also the poorest people that I've ever been around. They're Stone Age Indians, and it took us 2 or 3 days of travel to even get in there. Well, during our last leg of the journey, we had to go by bush plane and land at an airport, so to speak, that they had cut out with chainsaws. And the tribe was waiting on us. About half were dressed, about half were not, but they were all painted up, and we got out and walked a really long way. Then we got down and dug out canoes, and we went on the Amazon River. It was at the headwaters of it. And finally, we got to Camp Wapani, which means I like it. And we stayed there at that camp. And we were so hungry. We hadn't had anything to eat, and we could only take 10 pounds each in with us for that trip. And I had snuck in 4 granola bars. That's all I had, and I was saving them and hiding them. Well, we went over to this hut thing, and they gave us something like a cup, and we drank from it. Now, it was pretty bad tasting. I didn't know what it was, nor did my family or my cameraman, and I found out later that when I saw how they were making it, I made the choice not to tell my family until we were on a plane back toward Miami. So we called this the Cup of Yuck. It was a drink known as the manioc drink. In other words, the women would make it with their spit. They would take a manioc root ball and put it in their mouth and chew on it for about 5 minutes and mix it with their saliva. And then they would spit it into this pot and put some water in it and bananas. And the reason I knew this is I got up early the first morning there before everyone else got up out of the longhouse, where vampire bats and Indians were asleep, and I filmed them actually making this drink. So I'm thinking, man, I'm not telling my family, or we're not going to have anything to eat for many days. We're going to get sick. We're going to tick off the Stone Age Indian tribe, for not eating their stuff. So that's what my family drank the whole time, and I would sneak back into the tent and pour mine out into the longhouse. And I'd pour mine out, or whatever. I'd drink a little bit of it. It was the grossest thing, man. Oh, and I'm so picky. But anyway, I'd sneak my granola bars out, and I'd drink a little bit of water. So when I told them on the airplane about my choice, that's the only time my wife has ever used the divorce word in our life. I still think I did the right thing. Hey, there's a place you can put in the description what you think. Did I do the right thing or not? And don't throw me under the bus, please. All right. So there are so many stories that emerged out of this adventure. And the one that I'm leading to is this. The first night that we had that manioc drink, our bellies were full. It's kind of like a sports drink because they've already digested it, and it just hangs in your stomach for like a day or two. You got energy, keeps you working. It's just amazing. Well, I'm trying to sleep in a hammock made out of vines, and I had to hold a kind of a grass blanket over my head because my head would kind of fall out like that, and that would keep my head in. And also there's a vampire bat that will land on your forehead and scratch your forehead and then lick the blood. They actually don't sink their fangs in it and suck the blood. Also, there were two warriors right next to me, Minkai, who had killed Steve's dad with a spear, and also he'd killed Jim Elliott. And then we also had this man named Dabo. He was the fiercest warrior in the history of the Aucas tribe. He had killed over 250 warriors with a spear. And he had 5 wives during his lifetime, 5 families. Nobody could support enough, 5 families like that by killing animals with blow darts and spears. I mean, he was an amazing hunter. And that's why people today who have pit bulls that fight to the death call them, are you ready for this? Dabo pit bulls. He's right there, right next to me. Now, that's how legendary this guy is. He's a God follower now. Sweetest old man that you'll ever meet. And he was so excited about the foreigners coming that he had actually walked for 3 days and gotten there 2 weeks early to find out that he was way too early, so he goes back home. He was 81 when he did this. And then he came back, and he had gotten sick, something like pneumonia or something. And he's over there hacking, and sounded like his lungs were about to come out of his throat. And he would get up and spit, and he'd get up and just urinate right there at his little cot, whatever you call that thing, the hammock. And it's just a Stone Age Indian. That's what they do. So I'm trying to sleep in the middle of all this, plus 40 more people in that longhouse, including Steve Saint, my wife, my kids. I'd taken 2 Benadryl and a Tylenol PM to try to make myself a little concoction that would help me sleep because I was so tired. And in the middle of the night, it happened. Dabo had gotten up. I heard him over there hacking and spitting, but I didn't hear him use the restroom. So I figured maybe he's going to walk outside because I heard him shuffling my way. Now, it's pitch dark in there. I'm covered up with that little old blanket thing. And he gets closer and closer, and all of a sudden, he grabs my big toe and stops. Now, at this moment, I'm thinking he's reverting. He's going back, and he's in his, maybe he's sleepwalking, and he's got a spear, and he's going to drive it through my heart. And he's locating my body position. He's got my toe. He knows where my head is. He's about to find where my heart is and drive that spear through my heart. Now, as the story the next morning was told around the table, I began to scream at that moment. Not like a little girl, much higher pitched and much louder than a little girl. I was screaming, Dabo's got me! Dabo's got me! Help me! He's got my toe! Now, there's a guy that doesn't understand a word in English there in the longhouse, a couple of them, and I woke them up. I woke Dabo up. All he's hearing is, I guess, kind of like what a dog feels when you're talking to a dog. They're like, and then they hear their name. Dabo, Dabo. And Steve comes running over and grabs me and goes, Jimmy, you're okay. And I'm still screaming. And my daughter's like, Dad, it's me. I grabbed your toe. I was going outside to go to the restroom. Well, I was so embarrassed. I went back to sleep really fast because of the drugs. But the next day, when I got to that little longhouse table thing out there at the outside portico, I was so embarrassed. I can't tell you how it feels to think that a Stone Age Indian is about to drive a spear through your heart and you're screaming and then they're all making fun of you. But I can tell you this, it scared me almost to death. And I don't really get all that scared very often. Have you ever had thoughts like that in your own life? I mean, it's a moment of intensity like I have never felt before. I kind of think that would pretty well summarize what Nehemiah is feeling when the king singled him out and said what he said to him. That's why Nehemiah says, I was, now what's the word? Overwhelmed with fear. If we were to think about that from our just good old country boy, country girl common sense, basically it's this. He messed his pants kind of fear is what we're talking about here, okay? I mean, it's that bad. You know what I mean there, right? He was overwhelmed with fear. It was tingling him. It was shaking him. He was hyperventilating. I mean, I've been asking myself why Nehemiah responded in this way in this situation, and I think it was for several reasons. First of all, he knows full well that kings are at the top of the food chain. And if they perceive something negative, even when it's intended for the positive, the reaction can be swift with very harsh consequences. Here's another reason. Nehemiah could lose his relationship with the king. I mean, he's in a great situation. He actually knows someone of the greatest stature that people of his level would never know, right? And so he could lose that. Here's another one. He could lose his job. And if he does, how's he going to find another job among exiles that's going to compare to that one? I mean, he's got the best food, the best drink. He has to eat and drink it because he's tested it to make sure that the king's not going to die from it. He could lose all that. And in a worst case scenario, he could be killed. That's the fourth reason. And he might even lose his life at the snap of fingers. Whew, that's kind of scary, right? So let's summarize all of this. He could lose everything. That's what it boils down to. He had worked so hard to achieve these things through his lifetime, and by God's grace, he was put in that position, and he could lose every bit of it in 1 millisecond simply because of a question that the king asked him. So what do you do? Well, Nehemiah pressed forward even though he had great fear. Let me ask you what you do when you face fear. Do you press forward or do you withdraw and curl up? He told the Syrian king that his home city of Jerusalem, where his ancestors had lived, was in ruins. The walls are broken down. The gates in the temple are destroyed. This is what's making him so sad. So the king then asked a simple question. What is your request? This is basically a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I mean, words must be weighed very carefully. One's posture is super important at such a time. And Nehemiah's response to the king's question is very interesting. He told the Syrian king that his home city of Jerusalem, where the ancestors were buried, was in ruins, that the walls had been broken down, the gates were destroyed, the temple was broken. It was making him very, very sad. And so the king just asked him, well, what's your request? You just don't get that request from the king anytime in your life, right? Anywhere. It just doesn't happen. It's an amazingly rare opportunity. It's like winning the lottery. Words must be weighed very carefully. Now, one's posture is very important. As I mentioned, you don't want to look the king in the eye. Nehemiah's response to the king is very interesting, and we're going to explore that response in the next lesson. I hope I've set this up well because the response is truly, truly incredible. I'll see you at that lesson.